They don't necessarily want to hear my voice. You're all welcome this evening. Good to see another nice crowd here tonight, and just delighted to have Lorna Moloney come to speak with us this evening. We've had Lorna on other occasions, and she has always just been terrific with her knowledge. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of her academic biography, but if I read the whole thing, that would be the lecture, because she has extensive experience. She's an Irish genealogist, a historian, educator, and public historian. She specializes in Irish genealogy and surname studies, medieval Irish society. She holds a BA honors degree in history, politics, and sociology from the University of Limerick, as well as qualifications in genealogy, executive management, forensic genealogy, geographic information systems, and project management, as well as an MBA from TUS and a postgraduate diploma in teaching and learning from UCC. Lorna is the adult continuing education coordinator, program coordinator, excuse me, at UCC, as well as a part-time lecturer and genealogy summer school coordinator. She has done numerous conferences where she's promoted and delivered the Ancestral Connections Conference, which ran for several years, very, very good conference there, as well as she has also lectured extensively at UL, in the CWEL program, which is the School of Humanities, Graduate Studies, Politics, and Public Administration. In addition, some of you may also know her from the genealogy radio show from Radio Corcabaskin. Very, very good program there. If you get a chance to listen to it, it's excellent. And she's been doing that for 12 years as well. So she worked with East Clare Heritage. She's worked with the American Alliance of Museums. She's trained staff in relation to museum work and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go through all of this, but she has academic publications, and she is a resident genealogist in Dromoland Castle, and she also has an office in FECO in the Digital Hub. So without further ado, Lorna Moloney.
You're very welcome. You're really welcome tonight. My name is Lorna Moloney, and the title of the talk tonight is Irish Surnames and Sources Through Origins, Invasions, Conquest and Colonisation. So I hope it takes you through a journey of surnames and aspects of influence of surnames in Ireland. When we look at Ireland's history and maps, we get a very different picture of naming patterns and so on. And it's really these locational places that are still here today that start to give an influence of a tribal influence of what's going on in the 8th century prior to the Vikings hitting Ireland and so on. When we look at invasions and colonizations and all sorts of things, we think of the Normans and we think of Tudor conquest, and we think of Palatines, we think of Huguenots, we think of a range of different things that have happened chronologically over the centuries. So we're looking at origins, evolution, and transformation, because surnames and people who come in with surnames when they start to exist in one of the countries in Ireland. Ireland is one of the oldest countries to adopt surnames in the 12th century. We start to see huge influences and similarities too, though, in culture. So we have Gaelic, Anglo-Norman, and English influence, and we have anecdotes and surprising stories. Because a name you think is Irish isn't, and a name you think is English is thoroughly Irish, and so on. And you can never presume anything with a surname. You can't presume that MacAuliffe is a Duhallow Irish surname from the 12th century when it's MacOlaf, or deriving from a Viking origin as such. And McManus, Magnus, all these different little clues of how you read a surname are quite simple and quite useful for your own antiquity and past. So our origins, Gaelic antecedents and Anglo-Norman names and Tudor conquest, Cromwellian influences, religious refuge Huguenots and Palatines, 17th and 18th century military influences, 19th century diaspora, spelt wrong, bold, and not perfect after all, guys, not perfect after all. I take full responsibility for the spelling mistakes. Give us such a wealth of knowledge of how surnames come in and what changes occur with them. And every family, and Ireland is such a brilliant country to live in because we have such a multiplicity of surnames for such a small country. They're not just occupational, they're descriptive, they're cruel, some of them, and they change because we fight with each other and we decide we're not spelling our name the same way as that grandfather of ours, or we get cut out of the will, or we get told if we take the name and we spell it this way, we'll inherit everything. So we change and we deviate from our path. So the clan is nothing more than a larger family with a patriarchal chief, according to Charles Eastman. And this is important because it's something that we end up with subdivisions of names underneath clans. That you have a ruling clan and you have a whole subdivision of whole names that join in with that clan and are part of it. And by the 13th century, Viking, Anglo-Norman and Gaelic surnames dominate the landscape. And we have a wonderful landscape which often transfers the place and the surname as well. So you'll frequently go and look at the origin of a surname. I was doing it the other day and I was looking at the name Skehan, and I found the Skehans in County Laois in a townland called Clonpierce. And then in the neighbouring townland, I found that the neighbouring townland was called Ballyskehan. So it doesn't take a whole lot to work out that it was Ballyskehan was their patrimony going way back. And if I go and look at the maps that I'm going to show you tonight that are freely available online for you to research and resource, you'll be able to see how the patterns occur of conquest, what the changing names mean, who's out, who's in, who's getting pushed aside, who's getting pulled in, and all these are the influences of the time. So let's start with the Gaelic surnames of Brian Boru, O'Briens. And Brian Boru, of course, was never an O'Brien. He was Brian Boroiva McKennethick, and he was Brian's son of Kennethick. After his death in 1014 in the Battle of Clontarf, his descendants, about 80 to 90 years later, started referring to themselves as follower of Brian Uabrian, later meaning descendant of Brian. So this is a silver dollar of a lovely depiction of Brian Boru in the early part of the 20th century. And how does it work for the O'Briens, for example? You have Irish identifiers, surnames with qualifiers of characteristics linked to the landscape, physical characteristics, clan divisions, and personal status. And I wanted to show an example of this because in surnames, it's not a clear-cut, suddenly there's surnames for everybody. Suddenly there's ways of identifying characteristics, personal identifiers, which in Ireland we still hold on to. We're extremely fond of nicknames. We're extremely fond of separating out the McNamaras that all live in our townland by an identifier, whether it by hair colour, whether it be by trade, characteristic. And you will have grown up with that and just taken it on board as if it's natural, as if it's not done everywhere. It's not a feature of other cultures. So we have an unusual way of doing that. Our single personal names, our patronymics, our sons of and our grandsons and our descriptive names become very significant where we have the Rumacs, we have different ways of identifying. We have the Sheedy Macs. We have different ways of identifying in locales with a multiplicity of the same surname, especially. And where it comes naturally to us to know that branch aren't related to that branch just because they have the same surname and just because they're in the same townland. And we're very fortunate in the 1901 and 1911 census that it isn't so formulaic, that it doesn't give this actual deviation, because first names such as Dolly and Baby are all in the 1901 census. You never see that in a census today, but you will see these personal identifiers in the census where you see a multiplicity of the same name. So this is rather a bad diagram to some extent, but I wanted you to see exactly of a family tree of how they differentiate. And Donach Carbrook, for example, Carbrook is a place name. So they're still using place names besides their surnames to identify where they're from. Connor Nasudana is a place. So again, Brian Rua is a clan. He's part of Brian Rua. You have Brian Bawn. You have different steps. They start to go into a Gaelic lordship of chieftains rather than kings. You see a lessening of power. You have from kings to warlords, and they're warlords over certain patrimony which becomes bounded in the 13th century due to Anglo-Norman invasion, due to conquest, due to things that are happening, and due to their own branches becoming too big, and they rival off into cadet branches, into smaller branches, and they identify by these monikers or names and so on. Taig Kailishka, you know, all these things have meaning, just like you'd have American Indians by physical characteristics. This is Taig, I think it means of the tangled hair or something like this. So it's quite distinctive of how you get this. And of course you have Turlough Moore, and his bust is in Ennis Friary in 1306. You actually have a depiction of him in the 14th century. And Ennis Friary is a wonderful place to visit, to be able to see the different legacies of what we've got in the past. County Clare in your area in the 13th century cantrets, you're looking at the different regions, and what we focus on are the E-Cashin and the E-Bloyd, and underneath the E-Bloyd and the E-Cashin, you would have a whole connection of names mentioned in manuscripts, such as Cochrane Turlough, and these are translated online and freely available online through UCC Celt website. So you haven't got to buy anything. You can go through that Cochrane, translate it, go through all the surnames, see exactly who's fighting who. The McNamaras, I see your book there. They're taking everything in the 13th century, 14th century. They're taking absolutely everything. The rental of the McNamaras is an amazing document of conquest. Very little looked at really to see how much they conquest and have put their hands around and are able to get great fealty and homage and payment over land. So they kicked the Kennedys out. So if you're sitting next to an O'Kennedy, be very careful here tonight, because you kicked the Kennedys out to Ormond, which they didn't like. So just to tell you that these things die hard in the 14th century. Now we have identity and kinship, territory and power, memory and storytelling, and clues for genealogy. And in all the sources tonight, which are freely available online, and some wonderful sources to be able to look at, you see this kinship, and you see it linked up with the way they're sharing lands, paying rents for each other, backing each other up, marriage alliances, and so on. This is a little map derived from the geo map, and it shows you down south just what's happening down in Cork, where you end up with the O'Sullivans, you have the Cotters, you have Murphys, you have Barretts, and you have different. One of the beautiful things you can do with some of the sources is to look at where your surname may be and where it has ended up through the wonderful studies that have been done. And you can have a look at where they might have originated, where they ended up, how they expanded and moved, and so on. So these names, of course, one of the big clues I would always give you would be always to just Google it and translate the name into Irish as well, so that you have the Irish and you'd understand maybe where a variant is coming from, and does it sound the same, does it look the same, does it become something else? If people emigrate, do they take on a new name, and so on. And that doesn't always work, that it's a similar name. The Guckens, for example, emigrate in the early 20th century to New York, and they decide immediately to change their name to Hackett. That's a very big jump, but it's very well recorded in Library Ireland. And you're going, wow, I pity anyone having to look for their Gucken ancestry between 1900 and 1910, when there's just a sharp departure, and they haven't ran away because of any, or they're not trying to change their name for any nefarious regions. They just go, right, Gucken, no, Hackett it is, you know. So that's a very unusual sudden name change. But we also have literature sources. So we look at John O'Divigan and Gillan Naomh Húthrin, edited in the original Irish, and this gives you 880 verses, and you won't get to leave tonight unless you've learned them all off by heart. And that's all around Ireland, and let's go around Ireland or Fola, and the poem gives us the names of the principal tribes and the districts in Meath, Ulster, Connacht, and the chiefs who presided over them at the time of Henry II in the 12th century. So that's a manuscript, two manuscripts that are tied together, one at a later stage, one at an earlier stage, and one that gives you such a superb legacy of who's who in Ireland at this time. So what do we have in Ireland that's different to other countries? Well, I looked at this for the research for the talk tonight, and I thought, oh, Normans, they'll be the same everywhere. Well, when they go to Italy, they're not the same. When they go to Sicily and the Normans go, they tend to just take a toponymic name. They go Raymond de Palermo, or something like this, or Roberto de Palermo. They take the name of a place. They don't take a hereditary aspect like Fitzgerald and things like that. So hereditary starts to become important in the Anglo-Norman. And of course, that's completely at odds with Gaelic Irish inheritance. Because Gaelic Irish inheritance is elective. It's around a pool of a Dera Finna, about 216 people with eligibility to some extent, causing great internecine strife, but not eldest son inheritance. So there's a fracture there that occurs in what's going on with surname and so on. So linked to kingship and clan structure, and our hereditary surnames are earlier than most of Europe. What type of manuscript records can you see? You can look at antiquarian sources, and this belongs to a genre of Celtic revival historians and academics of the 19th century because they were obsessed with antiquarian sources. And indeed, these are freely available on Internet Archive. Books that you might spend €400 or €500 on, you can get free on the Internet Archive, and they're superb aspects of what you're doing there. We have a location of UCC, and Professor O'Donoghue O'Curran was very famous at putting this together, and it was a simple website, but it's just such a marvelous resource, and it's got a load of free publications that you can go and search and source. You have your annals of the Four Masters and so on, and you have them translated, which makes it even more easier for you to do a control find and have a look and see what's happening with the origin of your surname. We often have to decipher tribute manuscripts to link the names and later surnames. And we have the Dalcation, Dalgash, and they were a Gaelic tribe, and they became very powerful. And if you've heard of Dalcashan, Jane's a link to Dalcashan would be very strong. And you have a linking of families that had a great deal of territory and were pushed back into what became Thomond in County Clare to some extent. So the extent of their territory was huge. It was a lot bigger than what it became. They probably were pushed back with Vikings, lots of other sources, shrinking them. But the multiplicity of surnames when they emerge is huge. The Viking surnames. The Vikings are extremely interesting because you see the O'Rourkes, you see the O'Loughlin's, you see the Ivors, you see the Sugrus, And it's very simple what happens to Gaelicize them. You just put a mock or an O in front of it, and suddenly, hey presto, you have an Irish Gaelic name. So your MacAuliffe, your Sugru, your Godfrey, O'Henrick, McGettrick, you know, Toner surprised me that it was a Viking surname. I was surprised at that. I've come across it many times in Ulster, and I never put it down as being a Viking surname until I was researching for this. O'Bruther, Broderick, you know, Reynolds, Ranald, Magnus, McManus. The root becoming the main name, and then Birmingham, other names like this becoming entrenched from the 12th century on and becoming part and parcel and fabric of what's going on. Of course, the Harolds in Limerick, other names as well that are very clear to us that they're Viking in origin, but have such a strong antiquity and so on. So when we look at our clan, Brian, Rua, O'Brien, just to show you Cochrane, Thurlock, what's happening, and when we say, just to conspire to utterly harry Clan Cullen, we still have Clan Cullen. Clan Cullen, they're the McNamaras. So you have the two lots going on then. And they were to defeat them and run them out of their own country. And we have Thurlock O'Brien's male-clad sons, Dermot Finn O'Brien, and that would be Dermot Fionn, Fair, Dermot Finn. So identifiers, no need for tattoos, hair colour, physical. That's correct, they did. And probably a middle one, and probably another few apart from that. They were very powerful indeed and had a great deal of connections on that. And we have the O'Gunnings, the O'Shanachons, the O'Hogans, the O'Hearns, the O'Muldoons, and the O'Jurks. There's just a wealth of information in sources like that. So what do we mean when we talk about a clan and when we're looking at aspects here? What does it mean they're all related to each other? It means they all have alliances and loyalty to each other. And those loyalties last for centuries. You see them replicated when people emigrate in the 19th century. You see them maintaining their links under the Rundale system of farming. And you can see it entrenched in Griffith's valuation, where they're all listed and they're all part and parcel of the same clan kinship group that have happened for centuries. So fosterage, Fiona Fitzsimons has written extensively on this, and probably the best writer I've ever read on fosterage, and leads to sept multiplication, an increased bid for lordship claims. Very common fosterage, very ignored. What does that mean when you're fostered by another family and you suddenly have loyalty to that name, to that following? What's going on there? Subdivisions of new lordships, peacemaking strategies, but conflicting loyalties for burgeoning clan systems in 15th century Ireland. Our Anglo-Norman sources or Norman sources, what's going on in 1169? Well, we invite them over, they come over, and it's like a crusade for Henry II. It's seen as being, well, you know, we can gain lands, and Ireland has always been a vulnerable point for other countries because it can be used as a base to attack them. So it's been attractive on that front, though not to the Romans, who I think had considered it too cold and too damp for them. But we have the Norman naming patterns of the and the place named, such as you would have in the Sicilian aspect of the Norman toponymic names. Fitz, son of, and a Norman naming pattern resembles a mock or an O, but you'd have Fitz. So you'd have Fitzgerald, son of Gerard, and then you have his son Fitzmaurice, Fitzsimons, Fitzpatrick, all the different Fitzes that you can think of deriving from the original name. And there's a picture of an illustration from Giraldus Cambrensis, who didn't say very nice things about Ireland at all. We were rudely described as such. And this would be Maurice, a depiction of Maurice Fitzgerald, and seen with a sword that's nearly bigger than himself, but a very, very powerful leader and a very powerful ruler at the time. So what we see is the Gaelic names using mock, son of, such as McCarthy, and then we see the loss of the mock. So we see plenty of 19th century and 20th century Carties. And what's happening with the mock and the O? Why the loss? This happens largely to dispossess to some extent, largely to names that you never think there's a mock in, there is. Names that you never see an O in anymore, there was. You know, so these are the things that you need to think of when you're looking for your records, that you factor in the plus or the minus factor of that they may have had that. Both mean the same thing for the son of, but come from different languages and culture. Your Norman surnames, just a plethora of them there, of what's going on. And you see the Barretts, you see the Burkes, de Burgo. So you see such a wealth of them coming about. And ones that you may not think of, that you don't think are Norman or Anglo-Norman. You don't see Power, for example, de Puer. What's coming in these names? Where are they coming from? And what are they doing? How do they dominate the landscape? And of course, they become more Irish than the Irish themselves, largely because of the power of the Fitzgeralds taking over 15th century Ireland and governing Ireland when England is going through its own strife and trouble and doesn't have the concentration on Ireland as such. But we can't forget the 14th century statutes of Kilkenny, where it's very clear there's a huge division in Ireland, especially between the Irish and the English Church. And we see that in the accounts of pilgrimage and the sources in manuscript and the Irish boys and the depiction of the differences in the different parts of the country. So it certainly needs more investigation, and Coleman O'Clabby would be an expert on some of those sources where he would have looked at the Irish Church and the friars, for example, in the 14th century, and a brilliant medievalist who would look extensively at surnames at this time. So what manuscript sources do we have, and where can we see them, and where might I get to look at them? Where might I be able to, what might I see in them? Lowry Mania, Book of Leinster, the O'Clery Book of Genealogies. There's a huge obsession with genealogy for Irish and other cultures, but definitely in Ireland, there's just a huge fascination with it from earlier times. It's very prized and so on. And many of these sources can be seen on the Royal Irish Academy, where they've spent a fortune digitizing manuscripts, and they're freely available, and they often give a very good translation of what they're doing there. But they have spent a great deal of time and resources in this, and you're able to see what these manuscripts look like and what they can tell you and how they're made. Of course, a manuscript isn't the same as printing a book. It might take 25 to 30 years, 40 years to make one manuscript. You know, they must have been heartbroken when they got stolen, because they did get stolen from people's places during raids and ransomed back. Some of them show up then in the 18th century. Through the Conquest, historical sources, fiants, are an absolute fascination for surnames, because you have 120,000 names mentioned in the fiants. There are pardons, there are executions, there are the whole list of what's happening from Henry VIII to Elizabeth, and they give you a huge clue as to the warrants of what's happening with the different naming patterns and so on. And they show you the important government activities, from grants of pardons to the native Irish. Of course, in Tudor Ireland, when you were looking at a map, you mightn't see a map of places. You would see the early maps I've seen all have people's names on them, because that's what they were interested in. Who was where? So under surveillance, it would have been great to know who had you to get rid of, or who had you to put fighting with the other person, or who was a useful ally, or who was a terrible enemy, and what did you have to be careful of. And for any of you with northern ancestry, map making was an extremely dangerous occupation. Many of them were beheaded when they tried to map Ireland in 1568. So I wouldn't have liked to have been a map maker back then, walking into the wrong lands around Donegal. They don't call it the wilds of Donegal for nothing. So if we have any Donegal people here, oh, she knows what I'm talking about. I saw her. Yes, she does indeed. Yes. And they're not too different in Cavan either. It was a very dangerous place to map as well, around Tullyhaw and all those places. You wouldn't go in without good support and good family alliances and so on. So finds date from the reign of Henry VIII through that of William and Mary, and of major importance to persons doing genealogical research. You'll find them in the major libraries, and they're well worth spending a couple of days going through to see what's going on. And not just finds in literal form, but you have John Derrick's books start getting printed in the 1600s. So you see it switch, and you see people being depicted in images, in third-degree woodcut images. And this is John Derrick's, which is always published out in secondary school books, and it's actually quite denigrating to the Gaelic Irish, and it's a cartoon, really, for the time of propaganda, of look how stupid they are, and this is how they dress, and they cook deer right near the table. If you cooked deer near a table like that, you wouldn't be able to do so without retching, because the smell would be so bad. So the hidden clues within these pictures, but all these people, A, B, C, D, are all Sweeneys or Rourkes, different people who are depicted by their dress, by their colours, by their mantles, by what they're wearing, by what they're doing, and so on. So John Derrick's woodcuts are all available on the University of Edinburgh online, and they praise the deputyship of Philip's father, Henry Sidney, and his military campaigns in Ireland, and they cast the Irish in less than a favourable light. We get a great deal of information about surnames and who's who and what the naming patterns are. The use of defiance, some of the names have double or treble patronymics, giving up to 4 generations of descent, and the great majority of the labouring classes may have only occasionally figured, because pardons to Irish chiefs, your price, if you were something like 29 marks you lived, and if you were less than that, just a very small amount less than that, you could be executed without warrant. So you're looking at systems of martial law, where these martial law systems depended on what you were worth. And that's very much a feature. And Dr. David Edwards has done some magnificent work on this, what he's looked at martial law in Ireland in the 16th century. Example of a pardon, what might you expect to find? Pardon to Luke O'Toole, alias Fair O'Toole of Castle Kevin, County Wicklow, so that's the O'Tooles. Morgan O'Toole of the same name, a gent. A gent meant you were living. You couldn't be executed as such because you were worth so much, so they had to kind of give you some type of summary trial. Phelan MacMurrough, and that would be MacMurrough, Murphy. You know, you're seeing the different variants of names. Curlis MacRanald, that's the Ranalds or the Reynolds. And that you see then it wasn't Reynolds without the Mac, it was Mac Ranald. Dermot MacCahar, MacEamon, Moit of the same, a horseman. Hugh MacArt, MacDonough, Fair Callan, a Kern. Robert Roche, so he would have been a de Roche when he came in as an Anglo-Norman a couple of hundred years previous. And David, son of Thomas Mara, O'Mara, and of course you have Tumi Vara now today, and that would be a little Tua Vara, a big stronghold of the O'Maras back in the past. Conor Moran of the same, chaplains, names you don't expect to find. You don't expect to find a chaplain. You think to yourself, wow, is that a chaplain? No, that's a chaplain, the surname chaplain. And John Fitzroger, Nicholas Fitzroger of the same name. Now, there's very few Fitzrogers now, you know, so you find a multiplicity of surnames that you need to go through the files, and more study needs to be done of that. In-depth provenance, going back a little bit to the 14th century, show how these manuscripts disappeared. They remained and they disappeared, and what they were worth, and it was subsequently stolen from Trinity Library, the Book of Ballymote, and then it was recovered in 1785 by Chevalier O'Gorman, who allegedly purchased it from a millwright's widow in Drogheda for £20. So that might have been in the O'Gorman family for a little bit more than that, you know, because these manuscripts start to gain value and gain importance. And the Royal Irish Academy link to manuscript sources is there through the ISIS DS, and it's a really great site. Let's move on to the 17th century and Pender census, compiled by Sir William Petty. What's happening in 1659 in Ireland is that we're under Cromwellian rule. Cromwell didn't get executed or anything like that. He died in his sleep. They executed him after. They dug him up after and executed him. So just in case you're thinking of doing that with your own enemies, it's never too late. Never too late. And Cromwell, of course, had such a great influence on surnames in Ireland because he's giving the land to the adventurers. They're not getting paid a wage. The soldiers are being paid in lands, and they're getting moved in from earlier plantation times, and the land is getting distributed. You have Pender's census. Sir William Petty in 1659, the work on Trinity College Dublin website and the Down survey and so on is superb. And you get to see what the place names are suddenly starting to be called. You see the changeover and the Anglicization, not just of people, but of the places. And you can freely narrow your scope in on those maps. The census of Petty was edited by Seamus Pender, and that's why it's called Pender's census. It's also available on a subscription site, which is a superb site, John Grenham's site of Irish ancestors, where you can see the location of every surname as it would be under Pender's census. So you can type in your name and you can see where that name was located in 1659. And remember, the population of Ireland in the 1600s was an awful lot less than what it was in the 19th century. So when you have 120,000 names of a fiant source in the 16th century, it's an awful lot more meaningful in proportion to the amount of people that are living in the country. The survey in the books of survey and distribution, they're wonderfully available for County Clare in Frost's book, actually, James Frost's, and that's freely available online, an 1893 antiquarian source. It's also available through the Clare Library website. So many of these sources are available free of charge on the Clare Library website, which is probably one of the best in the country for genealogy research. I'm very proud of it. It's just a magnificent website for loads of things. It's been brilliant for the last 25 years. It's never changed in its quality, and it's just superb. So you'll get just a wonderful way of being able to do your research free of charge, looking up the Clare Library website. The survey books of distribution, what do they tell me about names? Well, they do tell me a lot, because they suddenly start giving me the names that are new there. And I've got the O'Briens, but I've got the McNamaras, I know them, but I've got the Stagpools, the Stritches, the Inglesby, the Clancys, the Fannings, the Dixons, the Cranesborough, the Maloneys, the Stephens, the Greens, the Whites, the Haslops, the Evers. Now, Ivers or Evers is a Viking name, Ivor, MacIvor. You know, so you can't just presume that they came in the 17th century. Yes, they did, but they were also here before then as well. You have the McCusicks, the Ayres, the Bradys, the Purgeons, the Carneys, the Burkes, the Graces, the Shays, Gormans, Fahys, Arthurs, a famous Limerick name, Dowlings, Morgans. So what's happening is these names are providing a great mix of sources and evidence that people lived there and were there and controlled lands. And perhaps, what's happening with those lands later on. Now, the types of records for Gaelic clan genealogy, Luke McInerney has done a great deal of work on this, and his work is available through publication form. A lot of it is available through the Clare Library website. He's published in many peer-reviewed genealogies, and this was a source that he referred to where you're looking at the identification of the Macs in a 16th century manuscript, and suddenly it's very important to them that they're identifying who are the Macs and who are the O's. And there's been various different arguments over the years whether there is apparently a statute in 1516 in Galway. So if you have any Macs here and O's here, they were told, don't come into Galway. You're not welcome. Or the Flahertys either. Have any Flahertys here? Well, if I have, you're not welcome in Galway, because apparently you were swaggering and walking down the street, really annoying them, and you're not to do that if you've got a Mock or an O surname in Galway city anytime soon. Because they were a walled town full of the tribes of Galway, and they probably wanted a peaceful existence of what's going on there. So very interesting. There's part of the Galway walls actually available in one of the pubs in the bottom of Shop Street, which was very interesting. It's got the fleur-de-lis on it and the whole lot. It's a lovely, lovely little piece of antiquity, just to show you that Galway was quite a lot smaller as a walled town, separated from the Claddagh, which was a separate village altogether. So the calendar of state papers, just to be able to ask what's going on with your surnames and your roots and what's happening and what these oaths are and what these state papers tell you in the 16th century and what subterfuge is there and the meaning of surnames and how people are getting expulsed and so on. But our place name evidence, Clonkesh or Clunkesh, Meadow of Kesh, Killadysert, Killo-Kennedy, Ballasheeha, Balla-i-Asia, Oshassid's place of abode, Ballycahan, Ballia-i-Cahan, Ballycorey, Ballia-i-Cork, O'Curry's habitation, Ballymacuda, and this O'Cuda habitation, that name is supposed to be extinct in County Clare now. So you have such a thing of a surname becoming extinct, dying out in a place. And you see a lot of that when you look at diaspora and you see names that were so plentiful in the 1840s and the 1850s in Griffith's valuation, and they're gone in Ireland now, but they're so plentiful in America because that's where they took root and survived. And you will get people to go, oh, you won't be able to find us. We left a long time ago. And you go, oh, I will, because they're rare here, but common there. For them, it's like looking at a needle in a haystack. But for us, there is no haystack. It's clearly exposed. That name has, thrived in America, but died here, with whole branches leaving during the famine. The 1641 depositions at TCD show you the new surnames which have come in that brief period in the 1600s to the 1650s, just prior to Cromwellian conquest in 1649. And you have 8,000 depositions, all of which give you such valuable names. If you have a rare surname, you can really look at a source and find out, well, were they at this part of the county or that part of the county, or where are they? It gives you a location. And once it gives you a location, it probably gives you the route of where you find records, which you don't find too many written sources. So moving forward, so you can move back, you have the 1901 census of County Clare. And in that, I understood that the Clare Library website still map those counties, those surnames, and you see hotspots of where the name was common in the tithe allotments, how it moved in Griffith's valuation. And that is a really serious resource for research to show surnames and migrations. You have exceptional surnames. Are they the new settlers? Are they found to be in previous records? So you can have a good look at that. And of course, we have our wonderful 1926 census coming out next month, and that will give us another fabulous resource of what's going on with early 20th century sources. Let's not forget the Palatine surnames that end up in a dare in County Limerick, the Fitzells, the Ruttles, the Youngs, the different surnames that come in, first of all, coming from Germany to London in 1709, anglicising quickly. So if they were Y-U-N-G, J-U-N-G in London when they arrived in 1709, they quickly became Y-O-U-N-G, Young, within a couple of years on their movement. Because they never planned to come to Ireland, by the way. They planned to go directly under the golden ticket to America. But what happened was it didn't work out, and they were sent to Ireland to settle under Southwell and in Adair for a long period, for about 70 years, and then they moved down to certain parts of Tipperary. And they were big involved in that Tipperary part where Methodism was occurred, and they took off then to Canada. So you see a whole bunch of them going en masse, available in the tithe allotments, disappearing, different, very, very different. Bringing in some things that are unusual, cystic fibrosis, high concentration, Palatine women not understanding why are our children dying? We have better food, we have better this. And that gene with a multiplicity on a various Canadian study that I just looked at, and how that translated then back and so on. So you see all these sources, and you see what's going on with the names, the Switzers and Fitzell, all these different funny sounding names that become intrinsic to the landscape for hundreds of years and become part and parcel of what's going on. The Huguenots then, superb at making things in the cloth trade, Huguenot graveyards down in Cork, different aspects of influence, again, moving, staying, becoming powerful, having an influence on what's going on in the place. Griffith's valuation. So we have a census substitute in the 19th century. People look at it for where their family are, instead of maybe looking at the volume of one of the things that when you're teaching genealogy, you would look at, I would always advise people to look at Griffith's valuation for the entire parish. You can get that through Falcher Road, which is a free site, and it'll give you just a list. So you don't have to go through each page separately, and you can go, okay, I just want to see how many of that surname are in that parish. And remember, you're dealing with civil parish rather than Catholic parish. So it might have different borders or boundaries, but it's giving you a very good estimate in townland census of where your people are, where they might have moved from, what's going on. And these valuations are in valuation books earlier on, and they link up to the tithe allotments as well. Now, this is a great resource, and this is one that you nearly need to get the link, the Geogenealogy of Irish Surnames, an award-winning interactive map created by Dr. Kenneth Field and Dr. Linda Beale, visualizing the spatial distribution of Irish surnames based on data. And it shows the concentration of surnames by county with larger font sizes indicating higher numbers of households. So impossible to see there, but if you take down the website, you'll have great fun, and you'll probably get to sleep about 5 o'clock in the morning, if I haven't put you to sleep by now. Now, Irish origins, I like this way of mapping. I like it when it's simple, when I can just see a color of where, who is who and what's who in various different depictions over time. And remember, this is time sensitive. But these maps are well worth looking at as a source to kind of see, oh, there's a lot there. There's more Viking there. And remember what you learned in primary school, where the Vikings settled. Did they come inland? No, they tended to like the coast, because first of all, they were going back home for the first 100 years, and then they decided they'd start staying and settling. So you see a different pattern of what's going on. And the Clare Library website, of course, this, if you type in a name, you'll see hotspots and different little areas. And it's a really very good way to see if your name moved from West Clare to East Clare or different parts of Clare. And why might it do that? Marriage is one, isn't it? You get married and you move off. You buy into the farm. It's a made match, and you decide that that's what you're going to do. So you might move townland for that. You might join up different parts and parcels. So it's a fabulous resource to see, well, is there a movement, especially if you have a rare surname? And even if not, it gives you just a great distribution of how many households with the same name and what sources you're looking at. MacLyseth's resources, the locations of the County Clare families, are absolutely wonderful because they're showing you where they are and what they're doing. And basically, we see some strange ones in there. We see the O'Callaghan's, we might see, we shouldn't find the O'Callaghan's really in County Clare, you know, but they were there because they were expulsed out of Cork to Hell or to Connacht. So they were given lands that they needed to move off across the Shannon. And again, little amount of studies really, when you think of it, done on that, on those transplantation certificates and what you're looking at for people that do move within that short period of time when this is being enforced. The National Archives site, please keep an eye on it because, of course, you have your 1926 census coming out, and I believe you have a wonderful speaker next month, Claire Bradley, talking on that. And that's such a wealth of resources. But don't forget, if you're from certain counties, such as County Cavan, you can go all the way back to the 1821 census on that site because parts of the census of 1821 for Cavan survive. So it's well worth you having a look at those surnames and have a look and see, are your family, and even to see the place names of 1821, because a lot of place names disappear between 1821 and the new mapping of Ireland in 1842. So anything that gives you a place instead of a coalesced townland, then when you're finding sources, you're able to link them to your own family name. Again, you have your hotspots again of a more common name happening there, and you can see just where the higher distributions are and where the sources are and what's going on. And as I say, you can move backwards and forwards and know whether they're there or not. Celt, of course, I'm very biased towards UCC, having been there for so long at this stage. And that wonderful website is free of charge, freely put online, and it gives you just the most wonderful sources that are freely available. And anyone studying genealogy or family history research should certainly take a look at it. Our major Irish kingdoms, just to finish out, that you first started out with these kingdoms, and then they became separate and smaller little patrimonies and annoyed Henry VIII very much, all these little petty chieftains, too many kings, and the eradication of them. So lots of little sources there of the genealogy, tribes and customs of High Fiachra, commonly known as O'Dowda country, O'Dowd MacFirbus. These 17th century 4 sources, if you had to buy them, would be €700 or €800. They're freely available online. Internet Archive is another one that you should look at. And download, I have to say download rather than not download, because it was hacked about a year and a half ago. If it's hacked again, it mightn't survive that hack. And I was very grateful that I had stored what I needed to store, rather than just go, yeah, I'll get the link. No, not for these, because they're just too valuable for what they give you. The genealogy of Corkalee, all these genealogy antiquarian sources are amazing. They're all translated for you as well, which is even great. And you can see the folklore and what's going on and so on. I don't want to finish without looking at irishgenealogy.ie. People see it as a civil registration search rather than a genealogy source, but it actually has records from the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. So it's well worth your while typing in a surname, seeing where the preponderance of the surname is, and seeing, you know, what sources it can give you, especially for Kerry, Cork, Dublin, in the baptismal registers and so on. And I have found some wonderful sources there, especially for Dublin. So we all grow up with the weight of history on us, and our ancestors dwell in the attics of our brains as they do in the spiraling chains of knowledge hidden in every cell of our bodies, by Shirley Abbott. And I'll finish with that. Thank you.
To know about that Celtic website.
Oh,
That's
superb.
not something, that I would have looked at. So I think you've made some great points there, Lorna. Does anybody have any questions for Lorna that they'd like to ask? Yes. Now, I tell you what, if you ask the question and I'll regurgitate it.
I have a Norman surname is Brown, right?
Yes.
So you Brown and Brown with an E. Like,
they're the same. There's just a variant, that's all.
Variant.
They're variant. And remember, don't get hung up on the variants because, you know, formal spelling of surnames is relatively recent. Even on the census, you will see your family surname spelt differently from the 1901 to the 1911 census. So don't in any way get attached to it, because if you do, you'll only be upsetting yourself for nothing. Maybe it's not my branch. They wouldn't have changed their name. They did, and they were Irish speaking in some areas, so they weren't going on this form. Our formulaic way of spelling and autocorrect is a really, really modern way of formalizing surnames. And one of the anecdotes I tell about that is the 1901 and 1911 census. And if you have a Limerick man getting married in 1901, he might be Jerry the Box Griffin. But when he's 1911, he's Gerard Alphonsus. He's very, very sophisticated indeed, and there's no nicknames, because married men had a higher status than single men. And
be 10 years younger.
exactly. Well, they're all pretending to be a lot older because of the 1908 pension. So you will see women having children age 57, their first child. And you'll see a great deal of that. You see a lot of age heaping. So it's older they get, unless they're means tested, and they're going to get a lot younger, because the McDonoughs in Galway, for example, shave about 20 years off their age. They're not going to get the pension anyway, so they decide to do it the other way. And the largest of age difference I've seen in a woman who emigrated, who was O'Halloran. And she took 15 years off her age, and until the day she died. Every census, exactly. And her family found it very hard to be convinced it was definitely her. And it was only the death cert with her mother and father that finally confirmed the rascal and the rascal age. She was 15 years older than her husband, and she carried it on till death. You know, that's a hard feat to pull off, you know, when you're not from too far away from where the husband was from and things like that. There's a few lies being told. And there was another family with 3 sisters, and they all lied. They all kept it up. Good 10 years there. So knocking years off your age isn't a new thing, you know, and very popular because people want to improve their marriage prospects and so on. And men, of course, tend to get younger and younger and younger in the US Census. So you see them born in 1861, and then you see by the time you're finished, they're born in 1872. You know, so they've shaved about 11 years off. Again, it's a work thing. They won't be as attractive in a working sense if they're older. There's no way of proving it. No real way of proving it. And they want to be able to work as long as they can.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, Declan.
Have you been keeping an eye on Y DNA and
surname
Yes,
or-
I have. Yeah, I have. And it's very interesting. It has a lot to tell us. It really has an awful lot to tell us. It also has a lot to tell us about how names switch and move, you know, and how they change. And for example, you'll find a name becoming very English sounding, and then you'll see it linked with a Y-DNA cluster and so on. So you see it becoming extremely important in that.
Has it opened up much?
It has, it has, yeah.
Is
But
there any website that kinda
there's loads of them. But
dedicates to that?
there's family histories for each of the surnames. They tend to be clustered into one name surname studies, which are a
There's
wealth.
one overall general site showing.
Not as far as I know, but I wouldn't be an expert on DNA. I tend to be a documentary manuscript historian. So I have a knowledge of it, but I wouldn't be an expert. But there are experts out there who would be able to point you in the right direction for that. And it's certainly really worth looking at. And you have to factor it in. You must factor it in. It's part of a development. You can't suddenly turn around and go, well, that's not important, especially if it starts to give you very valuable insights about, it often has proven me wrong, where I thought a family branch was a family branch, and then I find a fifth cousin belonging to another neighbouring townland, and I'm going, well, no, then I must be wrong. I must go back to the drawing board and go, what's going on there? Because it doesn't lie, you know.
Yeah. Joe, yeah.
If somebody cheated with their age, with their marriage and all that, would it finally be revealed then in the death?
No. And death certificates are notoriously wrong for giving parents. They don't, if they die in America, you'll find father unknown and things like that. And no, it doesn't get shown up in the death certificate at all. You just have to gauge, you know, the marriage. You know, they didn't get married at 12, you know. So they're shaving 10 years off their age. You know they didn't get married at 12 years of age, you know, or 10. So you're kind of starting to find sources that don't, or you find them in civil registration. You find them in an 1868 civil registration source for a birth cert, you know, and they're making out that they're born in 1878. Or a frequent one is to put down the wrong date of emigration. That's my latest one that I found. They put down 1894 and it was 1881. So there's 13 years of a gap, and their alien papers, their naturalization isn't matching that. So there's lots of other sources that start to corroborate it now online that may not have been available before, such as naturalization, such as census, and things like that.
How do you find records whereby they've married outside of their own area? So, for example, my father studied law and my mother's Dublin.
Well, the bride's marriage, the marriage certificate will give the location.
Yes.
In some cases.
Yeah. Well, we know where theirs are, but there are a few that are missing.
Yes.
And we don't know where. So, for example, my great-grandfather, I don't know where his wife came from.
But do you know who she is at all? No?
We do know her name, but we know very little else about her. And Dublin records are very good.
They are.
Yeah.
They are. You're challenged there.
And
the way I've done a few studies in Donegal, and the way we did it, especially in areas like Ardra and places like that, was through network analysis of looking at the patterns of marriage, of what they were doing, and the kinship ties of what was happening there, of finding out who they were. And that's how we did that. And we did that with the study of the Mulherns, okay, where we were starting to track back, well, there would be family stories of cousins, burial patterns, where people are buried, who they emigrate with, who they're working with when they're mining in America. The networks stay the same. They don't go to strangers. And that's why you have things that are really valuable, like the Boston Reporter reporting. They're very close to their family. Family member goes missing. They don't just go, bye. They go, where are you? Haven't seen him. Last time I saw him, it was 1851. They go looking. So there's all those little things that tie in the whole lot that tie families together. You know, they don't, if you're looking at them in isolation, you'll find it very hard. But if you start looking at them in unison and see that there's a replication of marriage patterns within the same families, and cousin marriages are common, you know, rather than not common, then you have your network ties that start to link you together. They rely on each other so much. They rely on each other for credit. They rely on each other for support. They rely on each other for farming. It's a very agriculturally based society. And it's a very tight society and very, very clannish, especially in Donegal. So that's the route that you take, because they're traveling en masse together over to Scotland, backwards to Scotland. And you just look at the whole pattern in the whole townland, and you look at the landscape, and you piece it together that way. And it won't be a mystery, because you may find two brothers married to two sisters in a generation further back. You know, things like that, double first cousins, common in Irish surnames and marriage alliances. Okay.
That was a great question. Now, that's a terrific answer. There's a lot there to, yeah.
But Donegal
unpack.
is hard, because you find it hard to get back before 1860, because the parish records do not survive, and it's very difficult to do that. Scotland's people is a good link, because they're going over to work, so you may have children that are born in Scotland and registered from 1855 in Scotland. It's earlier, you see, it's just those 9 years.
My great-grandfather married, where she was from, and that's where we have to find her. But my grandfather then married somebody from Dundalk, Bay actually.
Yeah.
My father then married somebody from Dublin.
Yeah.
So, but my mother then has family Wicklow and Tipperary.
Yeah.
So, we go very far.
I would say one of the biggest challenges is the rapid rate in which people remarry. If your nearest and dearest dies today, you might spend maybe a couple of years, but they're like remarrying within 8 months, you know. They have children. They have to agriculturally look after a whole household. Yeah, needs must. So that confuses people, because they have one child that was born with one mother who just always refers to that mother. But it's not. And you find a marriage, and you find a different women dying in childbirth, things like that. So you have that happening quite a bit with remarriage, and it causes a great deal of confusion, especially when you're looking at the 1901 and 1911 census, and you're going, okay. And then the change of name, like I had a woman I was looking at, Bridget, and she was Bridget on the 1901 census, and in the 1911 census she was Delia, because she was baptized as Bedelia. Bedelia is the pet name for Bridget. So it's more common to be Bridget. The names moving from English to Irish, especially the differences in the 1900 and the 1911 census. Yeah. So a John becoming a Sean, Seamus appearing, you know, names. No Neves, no Aoifes, nothing like that. We'll see, are they there in the 1926 census.
Interesting.
You know.
I was just thinking, do you know the way the names you said died out? I wonder, was there, you know, I know this is going to sound strange, but I often wonder whatever happened to anyone to have the surname Hitler. You know,
Yes.
Would they, did they just, decide to change widely? Is there any examples of it? I mean, imagine someone in Ireland had been called Cromwell before Oliver arrived.
Yeah.
But today suddenly find themselves.
Well, that's a very good question, because they do change their name, and people do, and especially in America, German-sounding names become very unpopular, and they start to anglicize them. Irish-sounding names are very unpopular to those who hold them, and they start to anglicize them. So sometimes they don't get extinct at all, but they're hiding under a different guise. And I was explaining to someone before the talk that I've seen headstones with family strife, and headstones spelled 3 different ways on the one headstone. So how you look at what's going on, and then people going under an alias. You have people who are constantly in the petty court sessions. It's clearly available that they're doing bold things like poaching. They're taking salmon, and they're under an alias. They give a different name, and they are known forever under the name of Meehan, but their name is Roach, because they fished the life out of the Meg River down in Croom. And their sources are there that it's only on the formal records of the births, marriages, and deaths that they are their real name. And in their other names, they're not. And in their known life, they're not. And I think it's legal to take any name you like still. You can call yourself whatever you like and become known as. Yeah.
They probably want to change it now again. When they were coming to England, the manager was writing his name, he couldn't figure out what his name was. And
Yeah.
the nearest thing came to was Shetland. He was putting down Shetland.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. It's how, and people hourly are taking down a name, and it becomes the record, and you're not going to argue with them, you know. Or your name is so long, you know, and you go, okay, I don't really need to be known as McShanachon. I'll go as Shane. You know, it's easier. I want to make money. This is it. This is over the door. You know.
We have a neighbour who is a twin. She's big underage, but in the mid-70s, I guess. And she and her twin are known, their maiden name was McNulty. They're from West Clare. But they have older siblings whose name is Kenalty.
Kenalty, yeah.
Yeah. No, obviously that's just somebody picking up the name incorrectly at some either at the first stage or at the second stage. But
it's different.
You see it in one family, isn't it?
It happens in one family, and then you get Smiths, and one decides they want the Y and they don't want the ITH, and they want the YTHE, and then there's various rows over these kind of things as well.
The classic we had was the baptisms. Whenever one of my older brothers is called Ennis, goes to the church to get baptized, and the priest refuses to baptize him with the name Ennis because it's not a saint. So he named him James.
Yes.
James Church. And my sister had the same thing happen to her.
Yeah.
And my aunt, who we always called Maureen, she was put down as Margaret.
You're not going to find Sean's or Seamuses in the baptismal registers.
Yeah, that's another one.
But they were probably known as Sean and Seamus and James and that, you know. So what something is written as is beyond the control in a baptismal register. And then the Latinized version of finding out what Margarita, Greta, the difference, deviance and diminutives of different names, and let alone the nicknames. We haven't even started on the nicknames yet. The nicknames?
All my mother's family were all called by their second name.
Yeah.
It caused so much confusion every time they went to go for passport.
Desperate. Yeah. Everything. It's just absolutely. And then you get the mother's name creeping in, you know, the middle name. And then the middle naming pattern emerging in the States and coming over here. Because it isn't as common here to have the middle name usage, but it's really common in America. And that's starting to have a huge influence on how we name and what's going on.
What do you mean, like J. Edgar Hoover?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They have all middle names in America, but we don't here. But you have people who emigrate and they come back, they stay. So they're Michael Dennis and things like that. And then someone switches it to Dennis Michael, and then they're known as Denny or Danny or Dan the Man or something like this. You know, I mean, absolute unbelievable of what's going on, of what's happening, of deviations.
Okay. Do we have any more questions or?
But if we think this,
I know.
The new people, say some women get married now, they keep their names, so the kids might be like Kathy or Ryan. And
Yes.
like, I think it's going to lead to confusion.
It always has, though. I mean, it always has. There always has been that preponderance for the maternal line to be known.
If you could have a name, say you could have a
say, James Anthony McCarthy Ryan, like, oh, for God's sake, like, you know.
Yeah, I know, yeah,
it's
it does.
going to lead to-
Well, you need to have your genealogy done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking the
You'll have to
future,
have
we'll
your-
have to track them down.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
But at least from here on, we'll have the benefit of computers, which can remember all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Whereas the times that we're talking about tonight, there was none of that.
I wonder though, because I mean, I know superb people. I know a man who left school at 12 in Listowel, and he does all the legal work down there because he can trace everybody. And he doesn't need a computer. I don't use a computer, Mrs. And he doesn't have to. It's all in here. And it was learned from his father's knee and his grandfather's knee. And either you have it or you don't. Either you can trace or you can't. And it doesn't matter what computer you have. I know plenty of people with computers and they're well able to come to wrong conclusions and wrong evidence. And you just have one talk to the person who lives in the village and they'll go, you're wrong there because they moved there and that's not them at all. And they married into that and that's who they are. And I know that because that's my cousin and they married into that and he married 3 times, you know, not twice. That's where you get the information.
We're losing a lot of that now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where you get the valuable information, not necessarily the computer that throws up a record that gives you no context or no meaning or no understanding of what's happening. So I'd be slow on relying on too much computer work if I was looking at land boundaries and places like that and rights away.
You're not at risk of getting put out of business due to AI yet.
Well, maybe, you know, AI is really being pushed for many ways, but the problem with AI for some things with genealogy is it hallucinates. So it wants to please you. It wants to make you descended from royalty. And I'm always given to minds of Julian Watson. There are 2 or 3 different clients, and one of them will invariably want to be descended from Queen Elizabeth or some, you know, a Tudor, whatever. Just like Queen Elizabeth herself had her ancestry on a big tapestry going right back to Adam. So, you know, it's there in Lambeth Palace in a big scroll. You know, it's our nature. You know, we want this being. But when we think of today that we're probably living better than any 17th century French king, the poorest of us, it puts it into context perhaps.
Now, I think we'll have to finish there because we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. Thanks very much, Lorna.
You're very
Your
welcome.
explanations were excellent. Very good. Now, just before you go, if anybody is interested in this book, it is free. There are free books up there at the table.
Oh.
And yeah, I give you that.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Oh, that's
And there,
fantastic.
just
I love
our
these.
last meeting is taking place
Love
on the
these.
30th of April. Okay, it is the last Thursday. It's just before the Maybank holiday weekend here at 7:30, where we're going to have Clare Bradley discuss the 1926 census. Now, we did that later date for fear that the 18th of April, when that census goes online,
it'll
it
crash.
could blow up the internet, seriously. So we just